And we're live. Hello, friends on YouTube. We're excited to be here. My name is Kent C. Dodds, and I'm joined by my friend Kurt Mackey. Say hi, Kurt.
Hello. Nice to meet you, or see you again and meet all of you. How's that?
Yes, this is going to be great. So, basically, what is going on here is I'm working on something. I am using Fly for it, and Kurt is the CEO of Fly.io. We've been friends since I discovered Fly and started talking about it and stuff. Which I guess was around the time I was building my website. I wrote a whole big long thing about how I built my website back in 2021. You can read about my decision process there. But now I'm working on something new, and I wanted some help from Kurt with this. So this can be an interactive thing. I ignore YouTube chat because it typically involves a lot of spam bots and stuff. So for folks who want to participate and you can ask Kurt questions too. There is a channel on my Discord called Livestream Chat, and there is a special thread that my bot made that you can ask questions and stuff. So my Discord you just find at kentcdodds.com/Discord, and then look for the Livestream Chat channel if you want to ask Kurt any questions. But I've got a list.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so we'll get to those first. So yeah, really quick, I think it would be useful for both you and folks watching to get an idea of what it is that I'm working on. So I'm going to share my screen to show this. It's the Epic Stack. So it's actually it's kind of a remix feature, sort of. So Remix came out a while ago with this stacks feature, which involved a couple of stacks that were like pre-built projects that you can use to generate new projects that have various features and things configured for you already and everything, with some setup instructions and all of that stuff. Just makes it easier to hit the ground running with the trade-offs that you're looking for your app. And actually, two of them are hosting on Fly. And I worked a lot on building out these stacks. And in fact, both the Blue Stack and the Indie Stack are loosely based on my own website, which is, I actually got a lot of help from you, Kurt. So thank you.
That was great.
Yeah, most of the Docker stuff I can attribute to you.
What's funny is 2 years later, we do basically Docker generation at scale now. Almost everyone who uses Fly, we generate the Docker file for them. I just don't have to write it anymore.
It's nice. So you get the benefits of Docker without the drawbacks of having to write the
Yes, exactly. File. It is a dark art. I'm not sure I want to write Docker files.
Yeah, for real. 100%. Yeah. So the interesting thing about the stacks feature is that you can make your own. And that's what we when I helped release the stacks feature, that was like the big thing. It's like, you want to make your own. We made these stacks just to make it easy for people to get up and going, but we want you to fork those stacks and make your own. And with what I'm working on now, EpicWeb.dev, I want to teach people how to build apps the way I build them, because I've been doing this for a while and I have a pretty solid understanding of good ways to build things. And so I want to teach how I build things. So the trick is that lots of the things that I want to teach people involve just like a fair bit of boilerplate for configuring tools and setting things up. And so I'm building a stack that people can use to just like bootstrap it all, get it up and running, and then they can start working on their app. And that's the part that I'm going to be focusing most of my teaching on. That said, there are some things that I don't have solid opinions on yet. I do have opinions on, but they're not solid. And so I want to talk with Kurt about what are some of the decisions and the tools and the services that we should be using. How far can I take Fly? That sort of thing. So with all that context, I suppose one other piece of context here is I want to use as few services as possible. I pretty much like to avoid services. I lean heavily on, if I can build it in a couple days and I don't ever have to touch it again, then why not just do that? So I just want to see how far I can take Fly and my own custom building of things. If Fly can manage those things for me, or if it's better to use a service for these things. So and with all of that context, I think actually there's a little bit more context, and that is like what I've got going right now in the Epic stack. So currently we are using Fly, of course, using SQLite with LiteFS, so we can do distributed multi-region deployments. Not every app needs that, but many do, and so I think it's a good thing to have built in from the start. Using Prisma for the ORM, Tailwind CSS, Playwright for testing, MSW for testing and local development, vtest for testing, more testing stuff. Docker, of course, Prettier, ESLint, and TypeScript. And then also I need to add onto here, but I'm using Mailgun for email. That's one service that I am happy to pay for, because if you don't pay for it, your emails don't get sent. So it's actually not very difficult to send emails. It's difficult to get them delivered.
It's easy to spam, hard to
Yeah.
actually send real emails.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think email is definitely one of those things where you're going to pay a service for. Another one is my CI. I'm just using GitHub. I feel like that makes tons of sense to just use GitHub Actions for that. And then, yeah, payments. There's not a chance in the world I'm going to store credit cards. And so, yeah, planning on using Stripe for that. That is not built into Epic Stack, but that is one thing I'm going to build in. So I think that is, as far as services go, that's it so far. This stack does have images, and those images right now today are stored in a SQLite database, just as like binary, and then or whatever. I don't remember how it works.
Yes.
But I'm using SQLite as a file store. It works, but I don't think that this is the way forward. And I don't feel super comfortable recommending that generally. And so I want to talk about that. Also, all static files are being served by my web server. That works also, but I'm not sure I want to stick with that. Yeah, those are a couple of the things that I wanted to talk about. So with all of that, what thoughts do you have up front for me, Kurt?
I think one fun thing about this one is you mentioned the Remix Blues stack, which was Postgres, and I think your original website was Postgres and Redis, and then something early Remix, like really early Remix.
Yes,
right? Is that true? Yeah. What's kind of fun is we had a bunch of people set that stack up, and we learned a lot about how brittle kind of having all these external services can be, which almost directly led to LiteFS existing. Like it was
no way, what?
Yeah, that's exactly why we did LiteFS. We basically were like, well, this is what we want really is an app like yours to go up and continue working in 4 years as if it was static. Like you come back in 4 years and nothing's broken. And
I would love that.
Yeah, right. I think to make that work, you have to basically get rid of moving pieces, because the more moving pieces, the more kind of potential for failure. And databases in particular will just fall over one day when you're not paying attention to them, because you've added like one more row that you didn't think about or something like that. And so when we started looking at it, like an embedded SQLite that you could replicate is really very resilient, because if LiteFS basically falls over sideways now, your app will mostly continue to work. It'll degrade, but it'll continue to work because there's just not another service that has to talk to. So we're sort of like, some of this stuff has evolved specifically because we spent a bunch of time writing Docker files and hacking around stuff that didn't work the way it should have. And now we're to like a better state. It's very cool. So yeah, I'm excited about LiteFS.
I'm thrilled to hear that, because yeah, when we talked about LiteFS at RemixConf last year, and I'd heard of Lightstream and it sounded kind of interesting, and yeah, when you said that you hired Ben and he was working on this LiteFS thing, I was like, okay, that sounds great, because I would love to not have to connect to more external services, even the ones that like I'm responsible for. It's not like I was paying for another service off of Fly. Like it was all internal to Fly. It was still just not as reliable as I wanted it to.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's just it's so many things can go wrong. And not all apps like kind of need that attention. If you like, why force it? If that makes sense. So
yeah, precisely.
The first interesting thing here is you might be astonished how well SQLite and LiteFS work for files.
Really,
SQLite, I believe, and I don't have the numbers on this, but there's content out there about it. So if you're doing something like 50K files, SQLite is probably faster than the file system. If you're doing like 50 meg files, it may not be, but it's still pretty fast. And so kind of depending on the scale of the app you're running, you might just be fine with SQLite. It may never need to outgrow that, which I think is pretty fascinating. We've tested LiteFS is designed for smallish databases. Like I would be very comfortable running like a sub 10 gigabit database, 10 gigabyte database with LiteFS. So if you're taking a lot of image uploads, you might go beyond what we've really focused it on. But there's no reason to think it can't work to up to huge data sizes if it with the right tuning and stuff. So I'm interested you're putting images in SQLite because it's counterintuitively maybe a good choice. And I think the interesting thing to think about for a lot of what you're doing is like, at what point do you eject, basically? Like when do you start adding services? And when isn't this the right thing to keep running your app on? Because I think what you've got is very interesting. Even with I don't think the downsides you listed are as downside as they sound, basically, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that. My target target audience for EpicWeb.dev is people who are building businesses on top of their web platform presence, and not necessarily like startups, but experienced, like, we've been doing business, we want to improve our web presence and whatever. And so there's a certain element of scale that I need to consider here. But even at scale, like SQLite can handle a petabyte of data. Like it's amazing what you can do with SQLite. So I still feel like SQLite is a good answer for even large data sets. Now LiteFS, it would be interesting to throw that scale at LiteFS. But I'm kind of targeting like middle size. We're not building Netflix with this, but most people aren't building Netflix. And so that's kind of my target. My biggest concern with storing images in SQLite isn't actually SQLite. It's more the work that my server has to do to serve all those images. And so this is kind of related to, I didn't write this down. I'm going to write it down just in case we don't get to it. But I'm curious about auto scaling. So I'm just not sure how, like if I start getting a lot of traffic, am I so sure that I want my server to be working on pulling images out of SQLite and streaming them to all these clients when it should be working on like delivering, rendering the pages and stuff, right? Can you give me any insights on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to worry about. I think one of the things about like static file caching or CDNs is what you're actually doing is getting another computer to do that work. It's not necessarily that the work's not happening. It's that something else is doing it. I think so like in a perfect, and like theoretically, right, with Remix and SQLite, you could actually serve a tremendous amount of traffic out of SQLite and images to users. I think the risk for your app is that like you have to actually like it has to be built well. Does that make sense? Like there's like the naive way to do this stuff, and then there's the optimized way you need to get to at scale. And so like it may not make sense to spend the time to make the app good at this effectively if you have a way to kind of offload the static files. One of the ways I think about this is everyone that watches you knows what a CDN is, right? Or do I show?
Probably. Just if you don't know it, go Google Content Delivery Network and learn all about it, because CDNs are like critical to a web infrastructure.
One of the ways I think about this is like a CDN is very good for taking one file and sending exactly that file to 1 million people. And CDNs are terrible at sending 1 million different files to 1 million people. And so depending on what the app is like, you might find yourself with like a few images that you're serving to everybody, or you might find yourself with a lot more images that you're serving to fewer people. And I think that if at scale, and again, yeah, you're right, it's not Netflix scale. In fact, there's like two kinds of apps. There's apps that run a business, and then there's like tech startups, right? And like Netflix is one of those. And I think a lot of people, we get a lot of Remix users building Shopify apps, for example. The scale the Shopify app will hit is very different than anything Netflix does. And so I think at scale, like I'm not sure that these will ever get to the scale where you have to have a CDN. I think what's the most important thing here is probably just to test to make sure performance is what you want from where you want it to be. I think one of the downsides of having the app and SQLite serve these images is you have to pay us, which is great for me. You have to pay us to like get those images and get your app process running everywhere. You're buying RAM and CPU and disk from us to do that, and the regions you're in. And I think there's kind of a lot of apps where that doesn't make sense to you. It still makes sense to me. It's so great. But there's a lot of apps where the kind of the cost trade-off of putting a CDN service like Cloudflare or Fastly or like I think Bunny CDN is kind of neat these days. I don't know if you've seen that one yet.
No, I haven't heard of that one.
That's the I think Bunny CDN is like kind of the hacker favorite at the moment for people who like to do the different thing because it's interesting and new. I think it's called Bunny CDN. Yeah, it's worth looking at. I think for an app like this, it's more of a performance versus dollars trade-off. I think the very simple thing to do here is just pay us a lot of money and run a lot of instances on fly, but it doesn't make sense if the app's not worth it, if that makes sense. It's
yeah, like okay. So in your mind, there's you get to a scale where it makes a lot more sense to use a CDN because it is just unaffordable or like costs a lot more.
It's just a cheaper way to deliver. Like their CDNs are like optimized for delivering images without paying us for a lot of RAM effectively. It's kind of the simple way to think about it.
Got it.
That said, the way you have this app built, I think this might be a thing to build in is like, how do you actually put a CDN in front of this when the time comes? And one of the really interesting things to do here is still have the app serve the images, but have some CDN cache them and basically like build in. I'm sure Remix has support for an assets URL or an assets host name that's different than the.
I think so. I'm pretty sure, but I don't know how that wires up nicely. Like when I deploy, how do I make sure that? I don't know. I'd have to look.
Rails did this really well. Rails back in when you were all children and I was an adult was Rails had this really neat trick where you could just run a naive Rails app, and when it came time to put a CDN in front of it, all you did was change a single config setting in your production config to say send people to this URL for images instead. And it was transparent and easy and like incredibly easy to graduate into, if that makes sense, which I think is a very neat feature of these kind of all-in-one, very simple to build apps. I think it's good to have that kind of flexibility later.
Yeah,
if you want opinions on how to build this thing, I've got them. Can't tell so.
Yeah, that actually makes sense. And so I could pretty easily establish a pattern of don't ever use like straight up image URLs. You call this function to generate that URL, and then that function just points to the CDN instead or something. Yeah,
and like Rails had I'm sure I would be surprised if Remix doesn't have like an image component that might just make this easier.
Not yet. Eventually, I expect it will, but yeah, not yet.
Rails is pretty good at making you use things like image URL functions instead of hard coding anything, and I think it paid off for them.
I actually have one already.
Great.
So yeah, that would be pretty sensible. Now, what I was imagining the way this would work is I would just put Cloudflare in front of Fly,
right?
And then Cloudflare would intercept all, or not even, well, yeah. So like anytime an image was requested, it would go to my server would do the thing and then come back, and then Cloudflare would just use the SMAXH header and handle it from there.
That would work.
Is there a problem with that too, or?
There's not a problem with that. And you have to realize I'm very incentivized to not have you put Cloudflare in front. So like I have opinions on this, but they may not actually.
Yeah, well, I'm interested in your incentives. Is it just because if Cloudflare is doing it and not talking to the origin server, then origin server is not doing anything, and so I don't have to pay you as much? Is that the incentive?
I think that's that's the one to be worried about. I think that one of the problems that I've always had with CDNs is it adds a lot of complexity. And so a CDN for just doing images to me seems small, and I understand it. And there's not a lot of risk in it caching something it shouldn't. A CDN in front of an app suddenly means that first, there's a lot to diagnose when it breaks. It's kind of an interesting set of problems. And so we think it's better to run your app traffic directly to your users and not necessarily go through something like Cloudflare. It seems to be more reliable, and it seems to be a little easier to troubleshoot when something goes wrong. And but again, it's not it's totally fine to put Cloudflare in front of the thing. It's not the wrong choice. It just seems less resilient to me over time. But there is that strong, like, we'd rather you give us money than Cloudflare incentive too. So just take that for what it's worth.
Sure. Yeah, totally. Okay, so here's another consideration with the images, and one reason why I've thought about using a CDN for this is I've got multiple sizes of the same image on the page, and so I want to optimize. And you know, when we ask for the little avatar in the corner, I want the server to shrink it down before it sends it back, right?
Right.
And when I do the hero image, I want it to, you know, keep the proper size. And if it's a mobile device, now it's going to be this size. So there are a lot of transforms that I want it to do, and of course that would be severely bad for performance to do that on request, you know, on every request, and I want to cache that somehow. So it, I mean, there's Cloudinary that does this, and Cloudflare also does this already. If I were to build this myself on Fly, I suppose I would generate those images and then save them to disk or save them in SQLite. Yeah. Actually, before I ask about that, what thoughts do you have about doing my own caching in that way?
There's two things there. You've got image service, which I think is a very interesting thing to talk about, and then you've got like general purpose caching, I think, in the app. Does that make sense? I would probably split those in your head. I think local caching in memory or even on disk is like the simplest possible thing to build, and it scales really well. The problem with it is it just gets hard to manage cache expiration, and so if you have the interesting tool you have here is LightFS. So you can actually, if you're caching something that comes from LightFS, you can kind of tell that it's just changed, and you can actually check the LightFS database and against the cache at every request, and it probably won't cost you anything, if that makes sense. And so you might
check the LightFS database at request time to see if it's cached. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Actually, let's talk about like an image variant. It's easy to query the LightFS database and say, when was the last time this image was updated, and also serve the cached image. So you may not have to worry about the cache expiration the same way. Like that'll perform pretty well, which is interesting. I think it's one of the neater tricks of doing this type of thing is you don't have to worry about purging caches all over the world in quite the same way if you just account for this while you're writing your code effectively.
So you mean because you can just talk directly to the SQLite database locally, and you say, oh, this is pretty old, let's eject it.
Yeah, and you've actually got the source of truth right there. So if you have your primary images in your SQLite database, you know exactly when the last time that change was. You don't have to worry about that. What happens when you do like an image service normally is the service itself won't know that the source image has changed because it doesn't have that data. But since you just have that SQLite sitting right there, you do have that data. You can actually just run two queries. And since SQLite's on disk, and by the way, this is the biggest cheat for LightFS and SQLite, is that since it's zero latency, you can run millions of queries a second against the thing, and you may not even notice. It's bananas. It's actually just really, it feels like a big cheat. So
yeah, it really is.
My favorite hack. Anyway, so I think it's perfectly, I think again, it's sort of like the scaling thing with the serving the images. You can totally cache in your app. It's really useful. It could just become complicated to write the code to do that. And somebody else might have already solved these complicated problems in a service and save you the effort of doing that. That makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So when it comes down to oh, well, you just have to write this code and maybe it's complicated, I'm a little less concerned about that because I can package that up in a library, and now all of a sudden it is complicated, but it's packaged, so it's fine. And so I definitely have thought about making a little package for that. And there's already packages for transforming images and stuff. It's mostly I'm thinking about just I want to limit the number of services, but I also don't want to explode my cost. Right. So the part of the goal of limiting services is to reduce costs. And I think that at the scale many web developers work in, and the scale of my target audience, reducing services is the better option for reducing cost. That's the hunch that I'm going on. Anyway.
I think it's true. It's also good for resiliency. That's the thing. It's just fewer moving pieces. Like if Mailgun breaks, we'll be sad because your mail won't get delivered, but your app's still working. It's like it's actually a reasonably out of critical path type service. An image
well,
service,
I mean, you can't log in, or you can't.
Oh, that's
create a new
true.
account. So like that.
Well, it's a good thing they don't break very often, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. Like, but it's the trade-off that we make, because if we don't use a service like Mailgun, then our emails don't get delivered at all.
Right.
So.
That's true. That's true. Even broken Mailgun is probably more reliable than sending an email at this point.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a good one.
But yeah. So for the images, then it sounds like just relying on sticking it in LightFS is fine, or sticking it in SQLite is fine, but only to a certain scale. You mentioned earlier that it's not been tested or tried beyond 10 gigabytes. Is that?
I think we've tested a little more than that. Like it's going to break somewhere between 10 gigabytes and a petabyte. I don't know. Okay. Right. It's very, if that makes sense. Like it could be 500 gigs. We don't really know. And a lot of it has to do with transaction volume. If you're not writing to it very much, it can actually go very large. And so we kind of just say that because it's like, this is what you should use it for. And if you go beyond it, you should probably do some testing. It's kind of the take there.
I see. So
which is actually an interesting thing about your project here is like, we're kind of guessing about a lot that might happen at any scale, but it might be worth like actually stress testing it and seeing what happens at some point too. Have you ever done that?
So I have done like load testing, but as far as like the size testing for LightFS, I haven't done that. Database, I think, I don't remember how big it is. So it's something like a gig right now.
99 I don't know, some made up number percent of databases are less than 10 gigs. So it's like most apps is probably fine. We were, it's kind of funny. Anyway, I think when it makes sense to add a service to save money, it makes a lot of sense. And then it just comes at the cost of another moving piece is all.
Okay. All right. So I was going to ask about using SQLite versus just writing the images to the file system, but then I realized, well, multi-region. So
right, replication is hard.
yeah. So may as well stick it in SQLite if like you said, as long as the images aren't ridiculously enormous, it's at par or even sometimes better. And I saw that a research paper about that as well. That SQLite is pretty dang fast paging, and who knows how that stuff works.
Right. I think the trick for that is like if you're actually, because there's the apps you're talking about, if you're doing like an e-commerce store, there's really not that many rights to images. It's not like you're putting in a million products a day in most of those. But if you're taking like user generated content, you might actually be getting a lot of uploads every day.
Yeah. And I want to satisfy that type of an app as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And that's I think that to me, the decision always go to like an S3 or an object storage. And it's almost entirely based on how much stuff is getting saved every day to the app itself. And I think that I hate to just talk about Rails all the time, but they did a lot of this very well. They have a storage, basically a storage interface and a kind of a pluggable backend for it. So I could imagine having a JavaScript or a TypeScript API that accepts an image and puts it on S3 or puts it in LightFS and makes it again pretty easy to graduate when the time comes, sort of like what you're talking with the CDN.
Yeah, that actually makes a ton of sense. I will I should write that down. That's a good idea. So just like an interface, or what's the word I'm looking for?
Interface.
It's like when you use a third party, but then you wrap it, or what is that wrapper? So that you can swap out
an adapter.
An adapter, yes. Adapter for images. I don't think I'll forget that, but I think that actually makes tons of sense. The nice thing is, one of the things that I love about doing images in SQLite is that it means you can work completely offline and your images work.
It's amazing.
It is,
and
so
local
nice.
dev's easy, and I think that's the thing that's we haven't talked about. Local dev when you're doing SQLite is phenomenal. It's so easy. There's no weird brew upgrade you have to do for Postgres. It just works, and it works the way you'd expect, and it's very fun. I love it.
Yeah. Completely agree. My life got so much better when I jumped off of Redis and Postgres into SQLite.
It's great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so as far as serving static files and stuff, we talked about this some more, but I just want to make sure I have all of the understanding I need. Like if I get slash dotted or hacker newsed,
yes, the hug of death. It's
it's
called the hug of death.
Yeah, yeah. Am I going and I'm running on Fly? Am I going and I'm using Fly as my CDN? So like for static assets and everything.
Yep.
Am I going to be really in trouble because I'm using my server is handling all of those requests for static assets?
I think the interesting thing about the slash dotted phrase is I think it was like 2002. I feel like we were running apps on Celerons at that point. It was a different time in some ways. I think you would be astonished at how much traffic just a node process and a server can run. So we run everything we do, we don't use a CDN. We just run we run everything through a Elixir Phoenix app. And so and we have like one instance per region. It's using maybe 512 megs of RAM, probably one CPU. And we get hacker newsed pretty frequently, and it just we don't even notice. It's just not the scale of traffic that matters anymore isn't actually humans. I think the bigger risk is either some sketchy thing, someone like launching an attack against an app, or something just goes wrong in like an API client. We have a customer that runs an API that shipped a bad update to their client and ended up like DDoSing themselves by accident. And that gets hard. And like one of the pro and con on us with this is you pay the same to us. You have to like actually add more capacity on Fly. We don't charge you more money and add more capacity for you. So like you're not gonna rack up like $40,000 in bills, but your app might break too. So it's a thing to think about for sure.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And in my mind, the server is not doing a lot to stream like these files. Like it's not that big of an ask on the server. So I'm pretty sure that I'm safe with that. There was something else I was gonna mention about
the attacks. Were you gonna ask about attacks? That's the fun one.
Yeah. I wanted to follow up on the attacks thing.
The interesting thing about dynamic apps like this is the really painful attacks are actually attacking the app itself, and it's not usually a load. It's not like they're trying to break it by overwhelming it with load. What they're doing is like spamming signups or doing something else that's just a huge, like a cost to the business, even if the app keeps working. So we deal with this a lot. Because one of the things about having compute is people want to like sign up and use us to launch DDoSes. So like a couple weeks ago on a Sunday, someone registered 65,000 accounts from 65,000 different IP addresses with like 10,000 different credit cards. It was bananas. And so that's the stuff that gets hard. And this is a time you might consider something like Cloudflare. They can catch a little bit of this, and they'll put up the CAPTCHA if you've ever seen that in
super annoying.
Yeah, I hate it. I think that one of the things that you mentioned with maybe the image component is like we're talking about a lot that you could bake into your application, but there's not really libraries for it because doing it without a CDN is relatively new. So like someone could build a library that worked as like a web application firewall or remix that would basically absorb load and make it pretty easy to adapt to these types of attacks I'm talking about, which usually what happens is you get an attack like that, some, developer wakes up at 2 a.m. all tired to see what's going on and has to mitigate it somehow. So a lot of the exercise is building in controls for your app that let you kind of respond to abuse. So you may be able to just turn off signups from Russia, or you may be able to rate limit things for one user, basically, or for one IP address. Basically, there's a lot of little fiddly things you can do in there that I think if we keep building apps like this, we're just going to get a lot of NPMs. Basically, there'll be packages for these things that you could just drop in and start using. And so my general feeling on attacks is like most apps don't have to worry about it. I think that there are high risk things. If you're doing a lot of like influencer stuff on TikTok, someone's going to pay to DDoS you, which is a weird thing. And so I think that honestly, I think the smartest thing a developer can do with attacks is like just be aware of if they're the type of app that might be at risk for this or not, because it's usually not your Shopify front end. It's usually something else where you've kind of pissed off some of the internet somehow and they want to take it out on you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, sweet. I'm fortunate enough that I don't think I've ever been DDoSed, or at least I've never noticed. So
Yes, I'm not sure. We absorb some automated DDoSes. So like, I don't know. I don't think we haven't noticed you getting targeted DDoS. I don't know if I could go look. But we get kind of daily DDoSes from people at this point. And the dumb ones are easy and you don't have to worry about it. The really sophisticated ones are hard and you do have to worry about it. There's just no button for it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, and those Cloudflare wouldn't help you with either, right?
No, I think that I actually think their CAPTCHA could be effective for some of those, but I just don't think it's worth it for the types of apps I'd want to build either. It's like the cost of that is high. They're just really annoying when that goes wrong.
Yeah, completely. Cool. Okay, so let's just thinking a couple other things. So we talked about most of the questions that I had on here were around the images. There's not a chance in the world that I'm going to do video myself, right? Like,
right? No, you'd use daily.co or something like that to do like video chat.
Yeah. No, I mean,
right.
Like users upload a video or
no,
something.
I don't. Yeah. I think that
or even I have like I'm trying to build a CMS and I need to host video, stuff like that.
Yeah. Even, you know what, I built the CMS for Ars Technica like 14 years ago, and they just use YouTube, or maybe it was, what's the other one? Yeah, it's not worth. Yeah, it's not worth doing your own video, I don't think, unless you have a really good reason to want to, I think.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, just wanted to confirm the insanity of that idea.
I'm trying to think of when people did. The times I've seen people do video is when they want to like put it behind a paywall. Like they don't want it available out. Like if you need to do auth in front of it, then you might start thinking about doing your own video, basically.
Yeah, I think mux.com would be the one that I would.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Look at that one's pretty. And Cloudinary also does video, but yeah, I've been impressed by what I've seen with Mux. Okay, let's talk a little bit about auto scaling. So for a lot of people who are into the serverless thing, they talk a lot about how my server or my bill is flexible with my usage. You know, and if I get /dotted now, I can handle, you know, however much traffic, and like that's fine. Like we talked about how there's the pro and a con of saying if you really get like way too much traffic, then it'll just stop working. That's actually kind of a feature, so you don't get surprise bills. But I think a lot of these services now are saying, here, you can put a bill range, and if you ever go beyond this, whereas with Fly, we're a little bit more limited on that because like the chunks you have to deal with are a whole machine rather than just like a little slice of a machine. So, and there are a lot of, you know, trade-offs for that we can talk about later, but you do have auto scaling features. So I want to hear a little bit about those because I haven't used those yet.
Yeah. So the new machine apps that we shipped a few months ago that like, I think new users have been getting by default since March now, are they're configured by default to scale to 0. And the way we do this is you choose how many you want running at any given time, and then we just stop the ones that aren't necessary and we start them back up again when they are. So you could actually, what users do with this is they control the max they'd want running by creating 50 and then let them all be stopped. They all need to be stopped. What you're doing is kind of interesting because one of the things about a stopped machine is it's not replicating LightFS anymore. And so auto scaling with LightFS is actually slightly more complicated. We've been toying with this idea of having, imagine you wanted to run 100 Epic app machines, basically. Like you want to be ready for that kind of scale, and find 99 of them are stopped most of the time, but you want to be ready. One of the things that we've been toying with is this ability to like have them wake up every so often and do some work and then go back to sleep effectively. Specifically for that, because it'd be nice to get changes to the database before the next request came in, basically. One of the neat things about what you're doing and multi-region stuff is it's actually, we start them by region. So if you have users in Japan, and it's right now like 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., 7 a.m. in Japan, they're just now coming awake effectively. So like the machines in Japan could have stayed stopped all night and just now wake up to accept traffic. And so there's this neat little it's called follow the sun workload. There's this neat little effect if you let them stop, basically, where they'll stay stopped where it's dark in the world and stay started where it's light in the world. That is kind of neat. But what we're doing is a lot more like, Someone called our infrastructure something like the cloud Gen Xers would build, if that makes sense. This is how stuff would work back in the early 2000s. And we're just taking as much advantage of, you have a machine and we can control whether it started or not as possible. There's far fewer abstractions than if we were trying to do something like Lambda or the Vercel functions. And I think it's great. Like, I actually think it makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm like a reformed backend developer. I'm like a backend developer who cares about users now, basically. And what we're doing is actually very surprising to people who came from the front end world that don't want to actually think about how many instances they have running at any given time. It's very foreign to them and weird. So it's a different model that I think is equally powerful. It just doesn't always make sense in people's brains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it also necessitates that your app is ready to run in multiple regions as well,
Yes.
or with multiple instances.
Yes.
Because yeah, if you want a distributed data, now you have to start thinking about, oh, well, I've got to make sure that I'm not trying to write to the read replica. And so,
right.
But I think for a lot of people, they're still not thinking about distributed data anyway.
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense. So is there anything I have to do in my Fly config to upgrade to the latest V2? I know that there's a flag or a command that I can just run and have my app upgrade. But I initialized an app just yesterday for this, and it initialized as a V1 app. And so I was wondering if I have my config old or something.
No, it's a per organization setting. So there's a config to change what your organization gets. That'll go away. What we're trying to do is not surprise people who had like automated new apps. Because we've learned every time we change something, it breaks someone's GitHub script. Basically, that's like the story of our life so far. So we've got a little wary, a little nicer, a little gentler about introducing changes because of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can send it to you. But it's in I think we posted it in our forums a few months ago.
I'm sure I can find that. That's fine. I was just trying to figure out what I needed to change to make it go to V2. Let's see. There was another thing I wanted to ask related to this. So just to restate what you said about auto scaling, there's some configuration I have to make that says I'm okay with my services going down to one instance.
Zero actually, but yes.
Sorry, what?
0 instances actually, but yes. So
okay,
we can work through that with LightFS. What you'd probably want to configure is 2 types of instances: one that doesn't ever stop, where you have one running, and then maybe the other one that stops and starts.
And so, the one that never stops is the primary.
Like the primary LightFS, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then I can go up to 50, and then I can. Would I then create volumes in like regions all over the place? And
yes, exactly.
Okay. And in that case, I am paying for the volumes. I don't have the prices in front of me, but the volumes are actually pretty cheap.
It's like 15 cents per gigabyte. So yeah.
Yeah. So 15 cents a gigabyte, you said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I got 10 gigabyte database at 15 cents. So $1.50 for, I don't know, like you have 26 regions or
35 now.
35. Yeah.
Someone just discovered Argentina. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So even if I loaded up every region, which is not necessarily advisable, that's not a lot to have. And then if your app is what most people's apps are, you'll find that you only need 1 or 2 regions anyway.
Right. I think we've seen it's like 6. It seems like because like to hit the English speaking world, you need 6. And then, well, I think the neatest thing I've seen is you just add them as you need them. We had a customer launch in Spain, and so they just spun up a Spain region. It was very cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's kind of I'm around 6 or 7 myself, and I just look at my analytics and see there are a bunch of people here, a bunch of people there. I'll just spin up regions over there. So yeah, so that makes sense. And then what I have right now, I don't have any auto scaling at all. It's just like these are always running. And so if I added auto scaling, I might find that like, oh, this shuts down a lot. I guess maybe I don't even, well, and in that case now, with your auto scaling, are you billing for how long I have the instances running, or just that I have instances possible?
Only when they're running. So we bill for the storage, and then only when they're running do we bill for the RAM and CPU, basically.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, cool. So I feel a lot better about, or at least I have a much better answer for people who are like, yeah, but with serverless, you only pay for how much you use. Well, yeah, I mean, and here we are paying for bigger blocks, right?
Right.
It's so it I think when all is said and done, you're paying more for hosting because you're paying for stuff you're not using. But I also don't have to pay for like 30,000 services,
Right.
SaaS things, because serverless can't do a lot of things
Right.
that you typically need. So
what we found is that serverless is interesting because it's really good for things that you don't care to run. So like if you throw up an app and then it never gets used again, it's fine because you basically never pay for it. And then for us, it's like if you throw up an app and it never gets used again, you still kind of have to think about it because you've got a disk or whatever still that like in 10 months you're going to have paid, $20 for over the course of 10 months or something like that. What's interesting is that when you do actually use your apps, like when they do serve traffic, when they're real live production, when there's things that get used, it's actually like substantially cheaper to run them on our infrastructure than it is to pay per function invocation or whatever. And a lot of that is because the plug is like a lot of that is just because we built on our own hardware. So the costs underneath are a lot lower than they would be if you were built on AWS. But some of it is just because like you can have one CPU with 512 megs of RAM that can serve 40 simultaneous requests on fly. And on like Lambda, you'd pay per each of those 40 requests, and you're paying like the same amount for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So there's a weird, like, someday I'll draw a diagram of this, but there's these weird points in an app's life cycle where like it makes a lot more sense to use serverless, and then it's like, well, then your app gets used, and then we're actually very good. And then you get to huge scale, and it really just depends on the app by then, to be honest, at that point. So it's a much more difficult choice than it sounds like sometimes.
Yeah, it's not quite so simple as like serverless is cheaper. No, not necessarily.
Right.
I always say that serverless breeds services. And now you have to start paying for these services. And so like at some point it kind of turns into sixes.
Right. Our snarky one is serverless is cheaper until you use it. Basically.
Period.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's pretty. Yeah, that's a little spicy.
Yeah, like it's late. Funny. It's Friday. I'm a little loopy at this point. So there we go.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So I think that covers everything. I may like throw a couple other questions at you later.
Sure.
But yeah, I'm pretty sure that I've got what I need. So what I think I'm gonna do is I'm not gonna bring in a CDN into this. I'm not gonna bring an image host or transform thing. I am going to do transformations, but I'm gonna build that. I think I'm going to have a separate SQLite database that's separate from my app database, and that's in charge of images. And all like image uploads will go into that, and then transform, like cached versions of transform stuff will go into that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I'll have to figure out the auto scaling stuff. Thing is, like, when people are just getting started, this is a bootstrapping thing, right? So we're just getting started. So like most of them aren't going to need the auto scaling and stuff like that at this point. So I think it maybe isn't like, here we're starting with this, but here's how you do this now that you've got an app that's running and now you need auto scaling. So just make sure.
Auto scaling config for us is actually scaled to 0 too. So they actually, this is when we do a new app now, it defaults to on, and then scaling up is a matter of adding a lot more instances, but scaling between 0 and 1, it just does.
Oh, okay. So that's the default. Yes. So the challenge there is if you that sounds a lot like Heroku, and where it would just like shut your app down, and then the next request that comes in has to pull it up. Is that's a basic idea, right?
It is. Someone twittered about this today. It is, but for like your app, it's probably like a 600 millisecond hit to start it back up, because the way we've done it on a lot of places, like 30 seconds. Yeah.
Wow. Huh. Now my app, I should check it again, but like sometimes when I'm watching the logs from the point where it says it's starting up to when it's starting to accept traffic, it seems like it's multiple seconds, like 5 seconds.
Oh, really? Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah. So that could just be like an optimization I need to. So it sounds like you're saying from the time Fly gets the request to the time it says, "Hey, server start," and like it's got the VM up and everything, is pretty quick, maybe 500 milliseconds or something.
Yeah, it
But
should
then,
be about 300 before we tell you to start, and then
yeah.
the rest is just whatever the app takes to be ready.
Got it. Got it. So if I can figure out how to make my app start really fast and start serving traffic, then that is less of an issue.
Yes, exactly. And I think Node can be pretty fast. Like Go binaries are incredibly fast. And Ruby is not fast. So if it's a Rails app, you're gonna feel it.
Yeah. Is there with the auto scaling, is there something where Fly can detect, oh, like this region is starting to get a lot of traffic, let's bring this up, and before we send traffic to it, we'll wait for it to pass health checks?
Right. It's not kind of, so we won't send traffic until it's healthy, but we might decide to send traffic to a machine that's starting and then wait until it's healthy and then finish the request. Does that make sense? Like we're not routing around it until it's healthy. We're hanging on to the request until the one that's targeted for is healthy. So it won't break, but you will get you'll have to get users waiting for that boot to finish.
Is there any issue with changing that behavior as a customer? I'm making this request.
It's more complicated than it sounds. So like we have a lot of ideas for how we want this stuff to work. We have a feature coming. I'm not going to say when because I don't want to, but I don't want to promise because it's a complicated feature. The perfect solution here is for us to actually suspend your machines like you would if you close your laptop and then wake them back up, which can happen in like 50 milliseconds. And you don't have to wait for the app to boot. You really just don't have to eat any of that. It's actually a lot closer to what, like, if you've ever used Lambda, they have I think the warm Lambda functionality. So what you do is they'll boot the thing, they'll let it run for a little bit, they'll take a snapshot of memory, they'll stop it. When the next request comes in, they'll just restore that snapshot of memory, and it's almost instantaneous. So
yeah, that's fabulous.
I think that's the fix.
Do that
when we ship that. We will. We're on it.
Okay, awesome. Then
I'm glad we can come to an agreement there.
Yeah, you do not. I retract my feature request. That one's better.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, I'm not going to do a CDN. I'll do image hosting myself, and even like file hosting. But as long as I have some intermediary that makes it really easy to switch to S3 or R2 or something, that for people if they need to go to there. And then yeah, I think that's it. Cool. So yeah, that helps a ton with these decisions that I need to make. So thank you for giving me some of your time today, and hopefully people watching,
that was fun. I enjoyed
got some help out of that too.
Yes.
Hey, well, thanks everybody. And yeah, I'll ping you again if I have any other questions about this, but I think I'm actually really thrilled because I wanted to use as few services as possible. So as long as I can get people off the ground with very few services and then make it really easy to adopt services when it makes sense, then I feel like we're in a good spot.
Yes, I love it. This is kind of right up our alley. So I'm glad I got to talk to you about it.
Yeah, cool. And I think the first service people would need to start using is file hosting. So if Fly could get that done eventually, that would be pretty great.
Also not going to give you a date on that one, but that's it's actually amazing. However we look, there's some kind of object storage would actually help a lot. So it's important. Yeah, cool. Well,